this session is funding the future. In other words, who's got the money? Where's it going to come from? Where's it going to go? For those of you who are from the real kind of grassroots side of the StirToAction audience, I just want to also let you know that at 2 o'clock today, we have almost like a follow-on workshop called Finance Clinics. Today we're going to talk about some of the kind of innovation in this space, some of the challenges, some of the kind of big concepts, that kind of stuff. For those of you who are really thinking, okay, I need money, where's that going to come from? By all means, feel free to raise those questions, but equally, do come to the 2 o'clock session where we're going to have a real kind of breakout and talk to you about your specific needs and challenges and how we can help you. Okay, so we're going to get straight into it. I'd like to ask each of our panel today to introduce themselves concisely. So, Jonathan, if I can start with you, just maybe 3 minutes, and then hand on to your guest panelist. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, and morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Jonathan Hutchins Levy. I work for a foundation called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I work in a team called Emerging Futures. The traditional work of the organization has been kind of challenging the existing system with a lot of kind of policy and campaigning work, but Emerging Futures is a new department set up a couple of years ago, which is more focused on resourcing and supporting those imagining and demonstrating alternatives. In terms of like the work we're doing kind of centered around that, so we're supporting organizations who are doing kind of this work, like kind of imagining, demonstrating alternatives that can be like the level of a building or a high street, and doing so in places across the UK. We're also interested in thinking about how to be connecting the hyperlocal to the kind of city level, regional level for thinking about that kind of a broader scale of systems transformation. So I've also been started doing kind of broader place-based work in Sheffield, kind of thinking through that lens. And then in our work, we're also thinking about kind of where wealth is held. So thinking like beyond our own role as like a foundation, and thinking kind of much more broadly about how the kind of transition to a new economy can be resourced and how much bigger and broader kind of pools of capital can be unlocked. So that's me. And if it's Bonnie.
So hi everyone, so I'm Bonnie Chiu. Thanks for inviting me here, and the venue is so beautiful and it reminds me of my wedding day, so I'm in a good vibe. So, what I do, I wear many hats, so I think a few hats are relevant to mention today. So primarily I run a consultancy that advises funders and social enterprises, foundations, investors on impact investing strategies and impact measurement. So I have got a good sense of how the sector works. Across the UK, but we also work globally. So it's called the Social Investment Consultancy. And secondly, I'm one of the 3 co-founders of Pathway Fund. So Pathway Fund was set up 2 years ago as a new social investment wholesaler. And I can explain a bit later what it means, but essentially provides funding to Black and minoritized-led intermediaries to catalyze more investments into enterprises. So that will be on course to receive dormant assets, and hopefully the new government will continue to champion the cause of social investment and civil society. But yeah, those are the 2 hats that I wear. But I just want to end by saying a lot of the perspectives and work that I do are very much informed by my own experience starting out as a social entrepreneur like 12 years ago. And it's really because of the barriers I faced as a social entrepreneur that I really felt, actually, I need to work on the funding side to change the funding system, because otherwise, there would just be so many barriers being replicated and potential of social entrepreneurs, particularly those with lived experience, not realized. So yeah, that's really my starting point.
Hi everyone, I'm Kiki, they them pronouns. I'm Director of Resource Mobilization at the Good Ancestor movement. I'm also very excited to be here. It's a lush venue. We at the Good Ancestor Movement are a non-profit consultancy firm, advisory firm, supporting individuals, so wealth holders and organizations, that's foundations, trusts, family offices, and other institutions, in first of all, aligning their wealth with their values and engaging in radical wealth redistribution. And all of that is kind of covered under our mission to liberate and mobilize resources in support of a just transition to an equitable and regenerative economy that is distributive by design, right? So that doesn't create these vast concentrations and inequalities of wealth that we're seeing now in the first place. And in that, I guess, the kind of shifting of not only wealth, but also power is kind of a core question we're always exploring in our work. And I guess to the reason I think also why what I can speak more about also here in the conversations later is part of that work we are developing different non-extractive, transformative, just transition aligned resourcing practices, tools, and vehicles that we're then testing with our clients and also the advisors we're working with to really kind of showcase the regenerative and reparative approaches that we hope to see at a much larger scale out there. So I hope to share more of that later.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. So I want to start with a kind of gentle provocation. And just when we talk about social investment, traditionally at least, we're talking about two things. We're talking either about debt or we're talking about equity. Now, think about debt to start with. We're talking about loans. Great idea. And the whole concept of social investment for me really started to gain traction maybe kind of 5-10 years ago. I started to see more foundations move into this space, kind of redirect their portfolios. The problem right now, to state the obvious, is that interest rates are high. And I'm seeing a lot of social investment products being offered at kind of 7, 8, 9, 10%. Is that really accessible? Are we at a point where we can really see the kind of revolution in democratic business with those kind of products, 7, 8%? So Kiki, can I start with you on that, please?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm grateful for you to bring that up right away. I think a key obstacle and problem at the moment in terms of what we're seeing in terms of social investment products out there is that there's these products still lead with interest rates and those being quite high, as you just shared. A recent social investment product I saw, which is specifically geared towards Black and racially minoritized social initiatives and enterprises, still expects a 7.9% return on investment, right? And I mean, we have a massive racial wealth gap also in this country, so that's already raising quite a lot of questions for me. But then also, more generally speaking, those kind of interest rates really don't make investments in those financing products accessible to a quite large amount of organizations out there. And if we care for social impact, we really should challenge this idea to enrich investors at the expense of social impact initiatives being able to reach financial stability and being able to finance their operations, right, in a much more healthy and sustainable way. So I think my one of the many things that we could be doing here is really to shift that focus to lead with interest rates, but rather prioritize, okay, how do we make sure that any profits generated through a loan, through an investment, a substantial amount of that, right, and I would say at least 50%, if not more, we will make sure that these can be reinvested by the initiatives into their working mechanisms. And then if there is more, right, once we exceed the other 50%, so to say, there we can then look at, okay, what can be returned to investors. And maybe we then understand it's much more realistic. It would be better to lead with maybe 2-3 low interest rates. I really hope to see more 0% interest rates out there as well. And there being really that shift away to actually prioritizing social and environmental return rather than financial return, so to say.
And Kiki, can I ask, specifically in your work at the Good Ancestor Movement, are you seeing people coming to the table who are willing to accept that idea, who are willing to accept those kind of 2 or 3% financial returns in exchange for the social returns that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we are specifically working with 1%, so people who have excess wealth, right, who are really on the benefiting side of an unjust system, and we are very lucky to work with people who feel quite uncomfortable about this and want to understand how they can do better. So yes, there is there are people in our, like the majority of people in our network are interested in those low interest, like 2-3% investment products, which in the end that basically means still you maintain your wealth, right? It doesn't really lead to decline. Again, we work on wealth redistribution, which also includes a substantial reduction of your wealth, right? Especially excess wealth. So in that case, 0% is kind of a minimum to consider if you want to use investments as a way to reduce and redistribute your wealth. So yeah, we are having those conversations, and that there is resonance for sure, and there's interest for that with the people we work with. Yeah.
Yeah, I will maybe share things that kind of further support what Kiki said, but maybe some other perspectives that may contradict. So, I think on what supports, your argument, yesterday I heard a speaker, not here, I was somewhere else back in London, where a speaker said in a 1.5 degree world that we're all, going towards, actually the world will lose 20% of its GDP. And if you're looking at 2 to 3 degree scenario, then the world will lose 40 to 60% of GDP. I've not heard those figures before, and I haven't fact-checked, but, you get the point that actually we are going to lose money as a society in this climate crisis. So why aren't we translating those ideas into how we look at investment returns? There's still so much fixation on market rate returns, which now we're looking at, 5 to 6% plus, given the inflationary environment that we're in. So I think that really needs to be turned on its head. What is ethical, reasonable to expect as a level of return for investors, given the world that we're in? And so on this idea of return, I've also debated a lot. I've done some work with Kiki and team on the Good Ancestor movement. We've debated a lot. Actually, should we take a stance on investors, these wealth holders should only expect 0% interest rate, etc. I'm personally a bit conflicted on that, because I also think if we set a bar, or it should only be 0% interest rate, that it also perpetuates this idea that entrepreneurs of color or entrepreneurs that are doing radical things like democratic businesses are then not valuable because they cannot return capital. So I do sometimes worry that it kind of perpetuates that stereotype, which is unhelpful, and that it also doesn't work towards community wealth building if we are kind of working just on the assumption that all these businesses will be break even. So I'm not completely disputing, but I think this idea of interest rate, it's quite complicated. And so I don't think we'll resolve this issue anytime soon. I've put up a provocation on LinkedIn, which has gained some traction a few weeks ago, which is this idea that a lot of investors, they will say they are sector agnostic. So they would invest in whatever sector, healthcare, oil and gas, doesn't matter as long as they get their level of return. So I then made the point, have we seen any investors that are return agnostic? So not necessarily saying 0%, but just return agnostic, because sometimes maybe you do invest in, hopefully, let's say a better version of Tesla that could actually transform the world if it could really drive the world towards e-mobility. So maybe in some cases it's good to have lots of returns, and then the question is how you redistribute in a fair way. But if we can just shift investors to completely just abandon the idea of return, and it's just then maybe a secondary thing. If you have good returns, great. If you don't, then it's fine. That's basically how mainstream investors have approached how we how we tackle issues around social and environmental change. Thames water, great. If we get the return, doesn't matter if we pollute the rivers. Like, that's basically the same idea. So I'm really hoping we can get investors adopt, impact investors adopt this idea of return agnostic, so that we ultimately see more capital flowing to these spaces.
Brilliant, thank you both. I want to bring Jonathan in, because when we talk about investors, we're talking about a very wide spectrum of kind of people, institutions, and so on. There's a very live conversation right now about charitable foundations as investors. Traditionally we look at charitable foundations as grant makers, but over the course of the last 5 years, certainly there's been very live conversations about, well, what are you actually doing with your endowment? We know how you're using the 5%. We can see that that grants data being published openly. But as Sophia Parker from your own organisation said at this festival a year ago, there's a kind of 5%, 95% conflict. 5% is used to do good. The other 95% is kind of propping up the same old harms. Not always, but often. So the question for you, Jonathan, is as in JRF, in terms of your approach to using your endowment and your potential as a social investor, what's happening there, not just at JRF, but in the kind of the foundations that you work with and alongside? What are the kind of conversations happening there?
So I think there's definitely a lot of momentum and kind of a real shift in thinking much more deeply about foundations using all of their assets and not just 5% towards achieving their charitable mission. And organisations like the Impact Investing Institute, who are one of our partners, have been doing amazing work in seeking to galvanise that and to be supporting foundations in having those conversations. And I think that for JRF, we're definitely kind of on a journey where we recognise that our endowment has, for a long time, it's been invested in public equities. So there's kind of a definite argument to be made that we're kind of with the majority of our capital that we're investing in systems that with the other 5% we're trying to dismantle. So there's clearly discomfort there. There's kind of conflict there. So we're going on a journey. We're seeking to kind of get our trustees involved in kind of conversations, thinking really deeply about what it means to be a wealth holder in this time of polycrisis, to be kind of thinking about the kind of just discomfort of kind of propping up systems that we know and it's in our kind of mission that we kind of believe need to be dismantled. So really important. But I think also with kind of foundation investments, and it's kind of going back to the points around social investment as well. I think it's good to think about from a kind of systems point of view how we've kind of ended up where we are. So how we've kind of ended up with foundations being kind of 95% invested in kind of equities, and then with 5% kind of added on, and just similarly with the social investment sector, kind of how it's ended up as being this kind of state or kind of sector that is kind of charging in several cases kind of 6, 7, 8% interest. And it's kind of thinking a lot about kind of where power lies when you're kind of thinking about the kind of origins of kind of how we've got to where we are. So it's I don't know if that was supposed to coincide with that comment on where power lies, but it's really important to be thinking about who's in the room, who's making these decisions, and who's kind of got the most influence. A lot of foundations rely on kind of big institutional fund managers to be managing their endowments, rely on kind of really kind of mainstream investment consultants to be kind of feeding into decisions about where these billions of pounds are being held and invested. So there's a need to be really rethinking kind of the kind of whole institutional kind of structures behind the way that kind of foundations and also wealth holders more broadly are kind of investing their wealth at this time, and thinking about how it can be radically transformed.
Great. So can I pick up from you? I want to hear about some of the kind of inspirations that are out there in terms of Jonathan's raised the question of power and decision making. I think, everyone's probably aware recently that, Lankelly Chase made a bit of a splash when they announced a kind of plan to spend down. And as part of that, one of the things they did is transferred a significant portion of their assets to the Baobab Foundation. I'm never sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Eli, I know you might correct me in just a moment. But so that's great, the fact that an organisation that's more structured like a community benefit society with different kind of members and stakeholders having decision making power over significant assets is inspiration. But is anyone else out there following suit? Is anyone else out there doing something similar or equally inspirational?
I think something that we're really hoping to see much more, and also with the kind of investment, non-extractive investment practices that we're developing and experimenting with at the moment, is really to see community-governed loan funds be established out there. And really, to go back to the aspect of return, it's not me saying we need to rethink return. It's not about that there shouldn't be any return in general. It's just about who gets the return, like where does the return end up in, right? And ideally that is, if we speak of regenerative economy, that is being regenerated within community stewardship. So the idea of community-governed loan funds is something we're really interested in, excited in, and I want to mention Barking and Dagenham Giving, who are developing something like more community-governed loan structures at the moment on a local level in Barking, Dagenham, and London. That's one example I could refer to. Yeah.
Yeah, I can give two examples. I think one is, while I think there's a lot of flaws with the social investment sector at the moment, I think actually parts of it is indeed working. So I'm just going to give an example. For my own social enterprise, we were looking at some financing just these few weeks. So I was calling up Barclays, okay, can I get an overdraft? So I was asking for 150K overdraft because there's some cash flow challenges. So then they told me, I can get an overdraft, but I need to pledge a property for it. So do I have a property? So as a company, we don't have a property, and I'm not ready to put my own house on the line. So I said no. So then they said, okay, you can get a 50K overdraft without any security. So it is really hard to get unsecured finance from the mainstream banking sector. And Barclays would charge 10% on that overdraft, right? So that's what you're working with from the mainstream. For the social investment sector, it's mainly unsecured loans. So even though it's loans, a lot of it, and we can maybe talk more about debt equity and the kind of pros and cons later, but normally, the market rate going is 9 to 10%, but it's unsecured loans usually. So I think that's a part of it that's working because, at least you're enabling access to for organizations to finance that is unsecured. I think where it is very challenging is indeed whether you have a business model that will return enough margin so that you can pay back the investors, and of course the ethical question on who are the investors getting the return and etc. But it's not like an inspiration, but I do think parts of it is working, and there's some minor tweaks that people are working on, such as pathway funds, to ensure that there are ways to address the lack of diversity among recipients of social investment to date. And I think that's another inspiration that I can share. So Pathway Fund was set up 2 years ago to really ensure that the social investment sector mainstreams racial equity. So we are sitting alongside Better Society Capital, which a long time ago has received 600 million government kind of capital, and they've been putting investments, repayable investments into fund managers in the UK to focus on social issues. Their sister organization is Access Foundation, which provides grant funding to ensure that there is indeed access to finance among charities and social enterprises. So these are asset-locked organizations, i.e., not more than at least 51% of their profits would go back to their social mission. And Pathway Fund is like the third organization alongside these wholesalers. They call wholesalers because they're really focused on building the market and building the fund managers and intermediaries rather than just channeling money direct to enterprises. So I think that is an inspiration, or that's an example that people have told us that they find it inspiring that actually we can have quite a bold vision on how the social investment sector can be more inclusive, and Pathway Fund is wholly black and minoritized led, and we will be receiving government funding. And in the past 2 years, we've gone on some pilots, one supported by JRF, and one program that's very exciting is the first-time fund manager incubator program. So we are providing core grants to organizations that want to raise their first investment fund. So these are usually accelerators that have been building businesses and they want to build their first investment fund. Only 1% of all assets in the UK are managed by black people. So, that's a huge equity gap at the moment. And we've funded 3 fund managers. 2 of them are accelerators, and one of them is is the Black Social Traders Network in Liverpool that's headed by the former Liverpool mayor, Jo Anderson, the first black woman to lead a major city in the UK. So it's been really inspiring to work with them, and I think JRF also really saw the importance of supporting more investment fund managers. People hold the key to funding. If we can diversify them, then the outcomes could also be improved. And actually, JRF structured it as partly repayable grants, so that we could also. So if the fund managers successfully close their investment fund as a result of us, then they will pay back some grant funding back to us, so that we can make this program slightly evergreen and then support the next fund managers.
Fantastic. Jonathan, do you want to build on that at all?
So which part of the question?
Just about the work that you're doing to support Pathway Fund. Is there anything else to add to that?
I think Bonnie definitely kind of gave a great kind of coverage of it. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Pathway Funds and the amazing work they're doing. Also, I guess I'll just kind of shout out to another piece of work that's kind of a part of it. It's the development of a racial equity scorecard, which is essentially a framework for looking at how to be scoring companies and fund managers on how they're performing from a racial equity standpoint. And I think from my own experience working on the kind of investment side of foundations, I think it's such a massive gap in terms of the responsible investment field around racial equity and the kind of ecosystem there, and the need for the kind of the data and the better kind of tools and convening that's needed to really be kind of holding institutional investment and companies to account on racial equity. So just another fantastic piece of work as part of the Pathway Fund.
Another provocation. It's fantastic that this work is going on around the kind of racial equity of kind of investment management. And quite a few years ago, we've got Social Change Agency and Bladegrave Trust in the room, who were the kind of pioneers of the Young Trustees movement. So there's been a lot of work around the kind of profile of trustees of charitable foundations. Is there any work going around kind of socioeconomic diversity? Is anyone sort of saying where are the working class people on the boards of charities and investment funds and so on?
Yeah, I think in general we definitely need to have an intersectional approach for sure, and look at all different forms of structural oppression, right? And prioritize the groups and communities that are experiencing most of that in the current extractive economy and like these new social impact investing vehicles. I think a lot of that also, like which I wanted to add as well to this conversation shortly, what we lean on a lot is happening in the US. Like there's really incredible work out there. To name a little bit, there's Seed Commons who have very clear non-extractive investment principles and structures. They're online on their website. You can see them there. There is the Justice Funders just released a few months back the Just Transition Integrated Capital Fund and a whole investment policy statement around this, which is an incredible guidance, something you can really use to lean on and also to understand what you can ask for, right? I think maybe there's a lot of people here more interested in seeking social investment, and I think there's also I really encourage folks to ask and put the expectations higher in terms of what you can ask for and inspire the investors that want to do social impact investing to do better. And then another one to definitely mention is the Social Movements Investing Report from Center for Economic Democracy, also in the US. There's an incredible amount of resources out there. And with that, it's racial justice is part of the larger social justice piece, and definitely also around class and gender and many different layers. Yeah.
Kiki, Jonathan, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say as well, just taking the intersectional approach is so important in the UK in terms of kind of access to finance. We've got this situation of kind of there being kind of 4 shareholder kind of owned banks that are dominating something like kind of 80% of the market, and those banks that are focused on kind of short-term profits shifting their business away from parts of the kind of poorer parts of the country and kind of focusing on areas where there's more wealth, and just kind of enhancing the kind of regional inequality that exists in the UK. So yeah, it's just definitely just so important to be taking the intersectional lens as well.
Yeah, I guess some other perspectives to complement. I still feel I'm relatively new to the UK because I only moved here like 11 years ago. But I think one thing that was quite different for me coming here was kind of the relatively low level of financial literacy that I see in the country, and maybe the lower levels of mathematical education as well. I'm from Hong Kong, which was a British colony, but perhaps we've kind of improved our education system since then. But I think financial literacy of individuals, is part of that story of investment readiness and access to finance as well, because enterprises are all led by individuals. So if we as individuals don't feel empowered to go to a bank, take out a loan, how would we be able to take those decisions in our own businesses? Personally, I'm helped by the fact that I have a mother who's an accountant, so I kind of growing up had to learn all about profit and loss, balance sheet. I think there was some child labor going on at home where I had to type up things for her. But, I do feel very thankful for those experiences, because that then made me very aware of the financing options, be able to challenge. I challenged the Barclays banker, about the security, because I knew I would have other options to turn to, etc. So I think that's all really important, because if you don't have financial literacy across all strata of society, then this problem would just keep perpetuating itself. And I think luckily there's also been some kind of renewed attention on this topic through Fair for All Finance, on the topic of financial inclusion. That's also one of the 4 cause areas funded by Dormant Assets scheme. So the 4 causes areas being social investment, financial inclusion, youth, as well as community wealth building, which is a new community wealth fund, which is a new area that they're looking at through Dormant Assets.
Well, I do want to come over to the audience shortly, because we've got some great people in the room, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I can see a hand going up early, but just hang on one sec. The last thing I wanted to ask of the panel before we go to the audience Q&A is, a lot of what we talked about today is debt, is loans, which are obviously a really important tool. Right now in the courtyard stage, John Dorsey is leading a conversation about community shares, and one question I've always had is community shares are amazing, they're a really new tool, they kind of democratise investment and so on. But if we're going to grow that as a tool, we need institutional investment. I know there are challenges around that, but I want to get the panel's thoughts on, is that a good thing? Is there interest out there? Are community shares are of interest to kind of institutional investors from charitable foundations and beyond? So who wants to take that question first?
Maybe I can start. I think community shares is great. I'm a big fan. We did support, one of my colleagues did support community shares unit to do a review of who are investing in community shares, and also found a diversity issue around that. And so I think one challenge of community shares is if your community is poor, then you don't have the money to invest. So inadvertently, it could perpetuate some of the gap between communities. But I think equity, actually there's a lot of potential to broaden the use of equity, putting money in exchange for shares in companies to be used more in social investment. Part of it is because of the kind of asset lock issue that I mentioned earlier. The dormant asset scheme does require social investment to flow to asset locked entities. That poses some challenge when it comes to equity finance. But I'm also learning about Islamic finance, and maybe there are people in the audience that kind of know more than me. But I'm learning from my friend Shisa from Up Effect, who's trying to really use the ideals of Islamic finance to influence the social investment sector. And interest rate is not legal or not permissible in Islamic finance, and the tool they use more is revenue share. Which is in between debt and equity, and also equity investments are also used. So I think there's definitely scope for more equity or equity-like investments. Foundations, I think, are still so early in understanding social investment. Foundations generally are very risk-averse. So I think Access Foundation is doing a lot to really bring other foundations into using their grant money for social investment. But yeah, that's just still a journey to be on. So, and I think JRF, it's quite, I'm not saying that because they fund one of my programs, but I think JRF on the social investment side, led by Denise, is really doing a lot of the more pioneering things in the sector.
I think for me it's kind of interesting in terms of, I guess, kind of thinking about like scale. So it's a question of in supporting kind of neighborhood and kind of community-led regeneration, thinking about what are the kind of financial pathways that are needed to really be kind of scaling that work, so that, as kind of Bex Trevelyan for Platform Places was saying yesterday, we can be looking at something like a shift to maybe 1/3 of community ownership in the UK. And I think that I think community shares is brilliant, but we're also really interested in thinking about like pension capital, for example. And I mean, because foundations themselves are just, in terms of the capital that we've got, it's a tiny drop in the ocean in the grand scheme of things. It's kind of unique capital in the sense that we can be taking risks that others can't, and we can be taking a much more kind of long-term view, and we need to be playing that role. We need to be being really risky. We need to be being willing to really kind of fund demonstrations and experiments happening at the edges. But there's also just kind of thinking about how we can be developing the financial pathways to be really bringing in that kind of institutional capital at scale, to be building building community wealth. And so I think it's we're kind of partnering with Platform Places and Footwork and exploring the kind of grant capital that's definitely the kind of core funding, the revenue capital that's needed to be supporting the sector at kind of much broader scale, and then also thinking about what are the financial pathways that we can be innovating and developing to be attracting that kind of big institutional capital into the sector. I mean, also to echo, I mean, community shares are an incredible tool, really important mechanism out there. And yes, I mean, larger institutional investors and foundations really should put resources and leverage their positions, the resources they hold to support more community ownership across the UK, right? And taking off
assets, properties, land from the speculative market and back into collectively and collectively hold structures. Yeah, and I mean, there is, what was it in the last, the 300 top foundations in the UK, just to give an idea of the numbers we're talking about, 300 top foundations in the UK collectively hold more than 87 billion pounds, right? The grant giving they're doing from that 87 billion pounds is around 3.7 billion. So how can we move those 83.3 billion in a way away from extractive, harmful practices in the speculative market into investments that really center community wealth and power building? So yeah, I think there's a lot. To me, there's a lot of questions around what are the structures, are the structures in place to facilitate that, right? Are we ready? What is the plumbing that we need to lay? There's a lot of talk also at JRF's Next Frontier conference was a lot of talk around the borrowing revolution, how do we hack the wealth defense industry, what different clauses do we need to put into the investment policy statement or our investment strategy in order to enable this shift. So there's a lot of work to be done for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm really keen that we come over now to the audience. So can we take some questions, please? Yep, I can see one hand at the back, and then we'll come to you, and then we'll come to you. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi there. I was interested that you mentioned the idea of local funds, loan funds, and kind of looking into it, you were talking about the example of Barking and Dagenham and the Kindred Fund in Liverpool. A lot of those seem to rely on kind of ongoing revenue grants to essentially kind of maintain the back office admin, the kind of wraparound support that's needed. And I guess a lot of those kinds of funds are also looking at that kind of 0% return or social investment return, which is meaning that those funds are kind of building down. And so I guess what's the alternative to those? Is that a sort of sustainable mechanism? And I guess the kind of the alternative seems to be having higher interest rates that kind of maintain the fund, but then that means it's inaccessible. So it feels like we've got sort of two sort of ways of doing things. I'm not, what in your opinion is the best way? Is there a middle ground?
I mean, I can quickly go to that. I think there is. Yeah, I agree. The 0% maybe in the long term, right? That won't be sustainable. So, but I mean, as said, 2 or 3%, that could be, if that is possible, wherever the fund is based, right? If that makes sense, then that could be an option. It's more, I think, my skepticism and criticism of existing social investment products out there is really about the high return expectations, and then also those going back to investors who hold the wealth, right? So it doesn't stay within community stewardship. That is one aspect. There was something else, but I've maybe hand over to you first.
Yeah, I think quickly to say, I mean, the traditional fund economics, which essentially is that fund managers charge 2% fee on assets under management and then 20% on the profits, that's probably not going to work for locally led and governed impact funds, and I don't think there's been enough examples and enough discussions at this point to actually model what the ideal fund economic structure looks like. But I think there's a recognition that needs to be permanent subsidy, and that is why we need to convince more grant funders to use their grant funding towards this new economy space, because it is an amplifier to all the social issues and environmental issues that they can solve.
Yeah, catalytic capital in a sense, providing that, yeah.
Max, could we take, yes, your question, please?
Hi, I've been working for a while in the space of ethical tech, And it's an area that I find is extremely hard to fund because most social investment is really focused on place-based, community-led initiatives. So I was wondering if you had any comments on that and if you see any positive movements in that space. I'm aware of organizations like Bethnal Green Ventures and so on, but there's so little happening and so hard to compete with VC capital and so on. And sort of connected to that also, the great power of community shares is that it's also patient capital. And if there are examples, if you're seeing more examples of patient capital, and something I've been particularly interested in is revenue-based finance, if you see that growing in the UK at all.
Could you just give us a very concise example of an ethical tech product that you're trying to, or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so I've been working a lot on the concept of platform cooperatives, so cooperatively managed platforms, but also generally just working in this space. Any type of tech that's been developed that isn't based on the traditional equity model of providing huge returns to the investors is extremely hard to find investment for that.
Right, so like a worker-owned Uber, something like that,
for example. But even less, cooperative models are quite hard to find investment.
I think so on community tech, so it isn't an area that we've been kind of involved in kind of as of yet, but at the same time it's definitely kind of on our radar and kind of definitely of interest. I think kind of the one I think it's Promising Trouble. I think the kind of who are doing some brilliant work in that space. It'd be good to chat more.
Yeah, I think everything is hard to find funding for. I think it's probably not just for ethical tech. I mean, maybe potentially housing. There's a bit more money flowing there in the social investment space. But I think it would be an interesting question to ask. Like I know Dharma well from BGV, so I'm curious. Have Bethnal Green Ventures tried to get co-investment from foundations, from social investors, and if so, what's been the reaction? My sense is that technology, like social investment sector, is quite old school, and if you look at the people leading them, they're really not tech savvy. So I think that's just the reality we have to deal with. But I think on patient capital, I was quite encouraged to see City Bridge Foundation reopen their social investment. One challenge is they just fund in London, and I'm like, how? It's so hard to identify what is in London and what not. But they did say on their website they're looking for really long-term returns, 10 years plus. So that's been really positive to see. So I will check that out, and then maybe send whoever you talk to, look at what they're doing. Would you do the same? Growth Impact Fund in the UK, which is very focused on channeling funding to diverse entrepreneurs, they have a revenue share facility, a revenue sharing structure that they offer. I think a lot of people are looking at the success of that to then see if they can replicate revenue sharing, because the economics of it is quite hard to make work. But I think that will probably help us see more adoption of revenue-based financing in the UK.
I think also just reiterate something that Kiki brought. There is some great work going in the US around this, and I was talking to some guys yesterday, I think from Kin Fund, who are trying, again, this idea of we need more funds that kind of recycle wealth and aren't kind of place-based. So I think there's a lot of learns we can take from the US and hopefully bring over here. I don't think there's an immediate answer, but there's some inspiring stuff that we can borrow from. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go to the last question. Max?
Do you mind if I stand up, because I can't see you? My name's Claire from Footwork. We support local innovators, like I think many of you, I expect, to tackle ideas and opportunities within their own community. Now, this represents a huge social capital and value. And at the other end, we're working equally hard to try and convince investors that there is a really valuable long-term social return on their investment, as well as a financial return. My question to you is, what evidence will convince investors of that social impact, and how can we get everybody together and collect that evidence?
Jonathan, do you want to start? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a question of like how much evidence do people need, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the kind of situation we're in the world with the various crises that we're facing, I think there's more than enough evidence to be convincing funders and investors that now's the time to act and to be investing capital at scale. At the same time, I mean, I know that I know that you do like some really interesting work around kind of video evidence in your People and Place program, and I think someone else was speaking yesterday about the power of that as well as something that could be kind of explored further in terms of that kind of storytelling and moving away from the kind of impact kind of quantitative reporting. But yeah, I think.
Maybe I think maybe we can broaden that question, because I'm not sure evidence is the driving force for investors to act. I think behavioral change of investors is still, we still don't know what really drives behavioral change among investors, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think for some it will be internal champions, and I think Jonathan's been doing a great job within JRF to push for some progressive changes. In some other cases, it might be pressures from the media and exposing some foundations for their bad or investors for their bad practices. And for some other investors, it might really be monetary incentives, and that's what the dominant asset scheme with the grant capital going to a social investment. A lot of the grants is actually used to plainly say, subsidize private investors so that they would not lose their money or they would achieve a certain level of return. And there's, ethics around that, and we can debate that in another session. But I think we just have to use different tools and seeing what sticks with particular investors. But it's like herding cats. It's a very long process.
Yeah, and to just build on what Jonathan and Bonnie just said, I think it's really about how do we convey to investors who care for social impact, right? How do we convey to them that they challenge a bit the expectation of there being evidence of the impact already now, right? If it's about long-term, deep systemic impact, how are we meant to show that right now, right? It's more about conveying a message to them and that kind of mindset shift piece, educational piece of making them understand that they should have a self-interest in resourcing social impact initiatives, right? In challenging how things are currently going, in challenging, countering through the investments, the ongoing extraction, dispossession, and privatization that we are seeing, right? So I think there's something to make them understand that, yes, there is their own individual needs, interests, risks, so to say, but there's actually right now we need to shift and understand what are the collective contextual risks that we are sitting in and that this investment is happening within. So it's more about, I don't know, I think there's a lot of shifting, also as Bonnie said, really shifting that mindset of investors and how they approach and understand the role of investments now.
If I could just add one more thing, I think it's also kind of a bit of a question in that if there is, from a foundation's perspective, if there is evidence that something works, then there's actually a question of whether you should be funding it for that reason, because it is for foundations to be taking really risky and experimental kind of positions on things. So I mean, in our work in Emerging Futures, our focus is actually much less on impact and much more on learning opportunities. So that really is kind of when we're kind of thinking about our portfolio of partnerships, grants, and so on and so forth. That really is our kind of core focus.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chiu. That's all the questions you have time for. We don't